The Nexus Combat Academy floated in the void between three star systems, a monument to galactic military excellence, and, more importantly, to the galaxy's rather impressive capacity for organized snobbery. Built from crystallized dark matter and powered by the collective egos of its faculty, the Academy had spent the better part of 3 centuries perfecting the art of turning promising young beings into instruments of warfare. What it had also perfected, though nobody bothered to put this in the brochures, was an exquisitely refined system of species-based hierarchy that would make a caste system blush with envy. At the apex of this delightfully twisted social pyramid sat the Big Three, the Vorthak with their impressive muscle density and casual attitude toward property damage, the Zephyrians with their multi-dimensional thinking and insufferable tendency to finish other people's sentences, and the crystalline hive minds who communicated through harmonic frequencies and had never met a problem they couldn't solve by thinking really, really hard in unison. These species had spent millennia establishing themselves as the galaxy's premium military material, and they had the combat rankings to prove it. Below them, arranged in careful tiers like some cosmic wedding cake, were the dozen or so competent species who managed to hold their own in galactic conflicts without embarrassing themselves too badly. Then came the adequate tier, followed by the "we suppose they try their best" category, and finally, nestled comfortably at the bottom like sediment in a wine bottle, were the humans. The Human Exchange Program had been implemented exactly 18 months ago, the result of some bureaucratic oversight that nobody quite wanted to claim responsibility for. The idea, sold to the Academy board with all the enthusiasm of someone recommending a root canal, was that exposure to diverse combat philosophies would somehow enhance the educational experience. What it actually provided was a convenient source of entertainment for the upper-tier students, and a fascinating case study in how quickly academic confidence could be surgically removed. Luna Kovac had arrived at the Academy with the kind of quiet determination that stronger species mistook for weakness, and weaker species recognized as the prelude to something interesting. She was small by galactic standards, which was to say she wouldn't have been particularly imposing even by human standards, with dark hair that she kept pulled back in a practical bun, and the sort of unremarkable features that allowed her to blend into crowds with supernatural efficiency. Her most notable characteristic, at least according to her file, was her tendency to observe rather than participate, a trait that her instructors had marked down as insufficient aggression for military application. The Academy's daily routine was designed to forge warriors through systematic exposure to increasingly creative forms of controlled violence. Morning sessions focused on energy manipulation, where students learnt to channel their species' natural abilities into focused attacks that could punch through standard battle armor. Afternoon classes covered psychic warfare, bioenhancement, and tactical analysis. Evenings were reserved for practical combat applications, which was a polite way of saying supervised beatings with educational value. Luna's performance in these classes fell somewhere between barely adequate and a subject of minor scientific interest. Her energy manipulation produced effects that could charitably be described as visible, her psychic warfare capabilities registered as theoretically present, and her bioenhancement results suggested that human physiology was either remarkably stubborn or actively opposed to improvement. Her tactical analysis scores were somewhat better, though her instructors dismissed this as irrelevant, since tactics were only useful if you had the physical capabilities to implement them. The social dynamics of the Academy functioned like a perfectly calibrated ecosystem of casual cruelty. At the top of this food chain prowled Thex'ara, a Vorthak female whose combat scores were matched only by her talent for creative intimidation. She stood nearly 8 feet tall when she bothered to stand up straight, her naturally armored hide bearing the ritual scarification that marked her as third-generation military elite. Her energy projections could melt through titanium steel composite, and her idea of a gentle sparring match involved techniques that lesser species used as finishing moves. Zilmoth represented the Zephyrian approach to superiority, cold, calculated, and delivered with the sort of clinical precision that made it somehow worse than simple brutality. Where Thex'ara might crush you with overwhelming force, Zilmoth would dismantle your defenses with surgical efficiency, explain exactly why you had never stood a chance, and then suggest improvements you might make before your next inevitable defeat. His forearms moved in perfect coordination, his psychic abilities allowed him to anticipate attacks before his opponents had finished thinking them, and his academic record was so pristine it had achieved a sort of mathematical beauty. The Academy's faculty had long since settled into comfortable patterns regarding the human exchange student. Professor Kethvol, who taught advanced energy manipulation, had taken to using Luna as a demonstration subject for baseline biological limitations. Commander Thex'ara incorporated Luna's combat footage into her tactical analysis courses under the heading Recognizing Insurmountable Disadvantages. Even the Academy's counseling staff had developed a specialized protocol for managing the psychological impact of extreme performance disparities. Luna's daily experience at the Academy could be summarized as a masterclass in institutional indifference, punctuated by moments of casual humiliation. She attended lectures where instructors discussed her species' capabilities in the past tense, participated in combat exercises where her opponents were instructed to show restraint appropriate to the skill gap, and sat through tactical briefings where human military history was presented as a fascinating example of primitive ingenuity. Her fellow students treated her with the sort of benign neglect typically reserved for laboratory equipment. They weren't actively cruel, which would have required acknowledging her as a potential threat, but rather displayed the unconscious dismissal that stronger species showed toward anything that couldn't meaningfully hurt them. Conversations stopped when she approached, not from hostility, but from simple irrelevance. Combat partnerships were arranged around her rather than including her. Social gatherings occurred in her absence as a matter of course. Luna's response to this systematic marginalization was to become even quieter, even more observant. She attended every lecture, completed every assignment, and participated in every exercise with the sort of methodical persistence that her instructors found both admirable and pointless. She took notes in her small, precise handwriting, asked clarifying questions that revealed an understanding of the material, and maintained the kind of academic performance that would have been impressive if it had been backed by any meaningful combat capability. The annual Apex Trials represented the Academy's premier social event, combining serious military assessment with the sort of ritualized dominance display that made nature documentaries look restrained. Students competed in carefully structured matches that determined their final rankings, which in turn influenced their post-graduation assignments and, more importantly, their position in the galaxy's military hierarchy. The trials were broadcast across multiple systems, attended by military recruiters from the major powers, and generally treated as the definitive statement on each species' current combat potential. This year's announcement had generated the usual excitement among the upper-tier students, polite interest from the middle ranks, and resigned acceptance from everyone else. The format would be standard: individual challenges leading to elimination rounds, with final rankings determined by overall performance across multiple combat scenarios. What made this year's trials particularly noteworthy was Thex'ara's public declaration that she intended to use the event to settle the question of human military potential once and for all. The challenge came during what should have been a routine tactical analysis session. Commander Thex'ara had been discussing the importance of accurate threat assessment when Thex'ara, apparently inspired by the topic, turned to address Luna directly. "We have spent months observing your species' approach to combat," Thex'ara announced, her voice carrying the sort of casual authority that made subordinate species check their posture involuntarily. "The Academy has been generous in its accommodation of human limitations. Perhaps it is time to provide a more concrete demonstration of these capabilities." The classroom fell silent, with the sort of immediate attention that comes from sensing immunity entertainment. Zilmuth's 4 eyes focused on Luna with clinical interest. Several crystalline students began the low harmonic humming that indicated intense collective focus. Even the instructor paused her presentation to observe what would happen next. Luna looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment for some time. "You want to challenge me to a formal combat trial? I want to provide you with an opportunity to demonstrate that your presence here represents something more than administrative charity," Thex'ara replied, her tone suggesting that she found this possibility as proximately as likely as spontaneous stellar formation. The Apex Trials provide an appropriate venue for such a demonstration. The murmur that ran through the classroom carried undertones of anticipation mixed with something approaching sympathy. A formal challenge during the Apex Trials meant full combat parameters. No restrictions beyond those necessary to prevent permanent injury, no allowances for species differences, and no expectation of instructor intervention if things became unpleasant. It was the sort of opportunity that weaker students spent months preparing for, and stronger students used to make statements about the natural order of things. Luna closed her notebook with the sort of deliberate precision that suggested she was thinking through implications rather than stalling for time. Standard trial format, single elimination, full combat assessment, winner determined by incapacitation or surrender. Unless you prefer some accommodation for human fragility, Thex'ara said, her tone indicating that such a preference would be noted and remembered. Standard format is fine, Luna replied, reopening her notebook and returning her attention to the lesson as if the matter were settled. Should I file the formal challenge paperwork, or did you want to handle that? The casual way she treated the challenge seemed to catch Thex'ara slightly off guard. This wasn't the reaction of someone who had just been maneuvered into an impossible situation. It was more like someone confirming the details of a previously scheduled appointment. The Vortak warrior recovered quickly, but not before several of the more observant students noticed the brief pause. I will handle the formalities, Thex'ara said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been uncertainty if it had come from anyone else. The trial will be scheduled for the third day of the formal competition. News of the challenge spread through the academy with the sort of efficiency that made military communication networks look sluggish. By evening, the details had been discussed, analyzed, and embellished, to the point where the actual facts had become merely one interpretation among many. The betting pools that operated in the margins of academy social life had established odds of roughly 1,000 to 1 against Luna, which represented less an assessment of her capabilities than a mathematical expression of cosmic certainty. The faculty response was more circumspect but equally predictable. Emergency meetings were convened to discuss appropriate medical protocols for dealing with extreme physiological trauma. Psychological counselors prepared intervention strategies for managing the aftermath of catastrophic performance failure. The Academy's legal department reviewed liability procedures for educational activities that might result in what insurance forms delicately termed permanent educational discontinuation. Through all of this institutional preparation for her inevitable destruction, Luna maintained her routine with the sort of methodical persistence that had characterized her entire academy experience. She attended lectures, completed assignments, and participated in practice sessions with the same quiet focus that had marked her as academically promising and martially hopeless. Her only concession to the upcoming trial was a series of solo training sessions in the Academy's auxiliary combat chambers, sessions that went largely unnoticed because nobody expected them to matter. The auxiliary chambers were designed for individual skill development rather than formal competition, equipped with adjustable gravity, variable atmospheric composition, and holographic combat scenarios that could simulate everything from zero-G boarding actions to high-pressure underwater operations. Luna's sessions followed no recognizable training pattern, involving long periods of apparently motionless observation punctuated by brief, precise movement sequences that resembled kata more than combat preparation. These sessions might have attracted more attention if anyone had been paying attention, but the Academy's collective focus was fixed on the upcoming entertainment rather than its preparation. Thex'ara's training sessions, by contrast, drew audiences of admiring underclassmen who watched her demolish combat dummies with the sort of casual efficiency that made warfare look like performance art. Her energy projections left scorch marks on the reinforced walls, her physical strikes registered forces that would have been impressive from heavy machinery, and her tactical demonstrations suggested someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the most efficient ways to dismantle opponents. The third day of the Apex trials arrived with all the ceremony that the Academy could muster, which was considerable. The main combat amphitheater had been configured for maximum spectacle, with viewing galleries arranged in ascending tiers that provided optimal sightlines for representatives from dozens of species. Military attachés occupied the premium seating, their presence transforming what might have been simple student competition into a display of galactic combat potential. Betting terminals had been installed throughout the facility, displaying odds that fluctuated with all the complexity of interstellar commodities markets. The morning's early matches had provided the sort of technically proficient violence that audiences expected from premier military education. Vortak students demonstrated their species' talent for overwhelming force application. Zephyrian competitors showcased tactical flexibility that bordered on prescience. crystalline hive mind representatives achieved the sort of perfect coordination that made individual combat look inefficient by comparison. Each victory was anticipated, each technique was familiar, and each result confirmed existing assumptions about the natural order of military capability. Luna's match was scheduled for the afternoon session, positioned to provide what event coordinators diplomatically termed variety in competitive outcomes. The audience that assembled for her trial included the usual collection of curious students, board faculty members, and military observers who were attending more from professional obligation than genuine interest. The betting activity had stabilized at odds so extreme they represented less financial speculation than mathematical certainty. Thex'ara entered the combat arena with the sort of confident stride that comes from never having experienced unexpected resistance. Her ritual armor had been polished to mirror brightness, her weapons checked and rechecked by technicians who treated her equipment with the sort of reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. Her warm-up routine drew appreciated murmurs from the crowd, each movement demonstrating the sort of controlled power that made lesser species reconsider their career choices. Luna's entrance was considerably less dramatic. She wore the Academy's standard combat gear without modification, carried no personal weapons, and showed no signs of the pre-combat rituals that stronger species used to focus their aggressive instincts. Her appearance in the arena generated the sort of polite applause typically reserved for opening ceremonies, acknowledgement without anticipation. The arena itself had been configured for maximum combat flexibility, a circular space 50 meters in diameter, equipped with variable terrain features that could be activated during the match to test adaptability, and surrounded by energy barriers that could contain everything up to and including small tactical nuclear devices. The combat parameters were displayed on screens throughout the facility: standard rules, no permanent damage, victory by incapacitation or surrender, medical intervention at referee discretion. Combat began with Thex'ara's immediate demonstration of overwhelming superiority. Her opening energy projection lit up the arena's containment barriers, her follow-up physical assault covered the distance between combatants with shocking speed, and her tactical positioning suggested someone who had spent considerable time studying the most efficient approaches to dismantling inferior opponents. She moved with the sort of fluid violence that made combat look like choreography, each strike designed to demonstrate not just effectiveness, but absolute dominance. Luna's response appeared to confirm every prediction about the match's inevitable outcome. She retreated under pressure, deflected attacks that she couldn't avoid entirely, and showed none of the aggressive counterattacking that marked competent combat performance. Her energy projections were barely visible, her physical strikes seemed to have no meaningful impact, and her tactical approach appeared to consist entirely of damage limitation rather than victory seeking. The crowd's initial excitement began to fade as the match settled into what looked like prolonged demonstration rather than actual competition. Thex'ara was clearly capable of ending the engagement at any moment, but seemed to be extending it for educational purposes, providing a comprehensive display of Vorthak combat superiority that would serve as useful reference material for future tactical instruction. Her attacks became more elaborate, her movements more theatrical, and her expressions more condescending as she demonstrated technique after technique against an opponent who could barely respond. What the audience failed to notice, because they were focused on the entertainment value rather than tactical analysis, was that Luna's defensive positioning had been gradually improving throughout the match. Her retreats followed increasingly efficient patterns, her deflections required less energy to execute, and her evasion techniques had begun to show an understanding of Vorthak attack sequences that went beyond simple reaction. She was learning, adapting, and improving at a rate that would have been remarkable if anyone had been paying attention to anything beyond her obvious inferiority. 10 minutes into the match, with Thex'ara's victory so certain that several audience members had begun discussing dinner plans, the Vorthak warrior decided to conclude the demonstration with a finishing technique that would provide appropriate dramatic closure. She backed away from Luna, raised her arms in a gesture that every species recognized as preparation for maximum energy discharge, and began the charging sequence for a combat projection that would end the match with spectacular finality. This was the moment that Luna had been waiting for, though nobody realized it until much later. While Thex'ara gathered energy for her finishing strike, while the audience prepared for the inevitable conclusion, while betting terminals processed the last few wagers on the exact duration of Luna's consciousness, the human student moved with precision that transformed her from victim to something considerably more dangerous. The strike was so fast that most observers missed it entirely. One moment Thex'ara was preparing her devastating finale, the next she was collapsing to the arena floor with a sort of systematic shutdown that suggested someone had just unplugged her from whatever source kept Vortak warriors operational. Her energy discharge dissipated harmlessly, her armor's power systems went dark, and her considerable mass hit the arena surface with the sound of very expensive military equipment experiencing catastrophic failure. The silence that followed was the sort of absolute quiet that occurs when reality deviates so dramatically from expectation that observers need time to process what their senses are reporting. Thex'ara, the unstoppable Vortak warrior, lay motionless on the arena floor. Luna, the harmless human student, stood over her with the same calm expression she wore during particularly interesting lectures. The arena's medical systems, confused by the sudden change in circumstances, began running diagnostic scans to determine why one combatant had achieved what appeared to be complete neurological shutdown. The first sound to break the silence came from the betting terminals, which began processing what appeared to be a systems error involving impossible odds and improbable outcomes. This was followed by the sort of murmured discussion that occurs when large groups of intelligent beings encounter data that contradicts their fundamental assumptions about reality. Medical personnel entered the arena with equipment designed to handle everything from minor injuries to complete biological reorganization, only to discover that Thex'ara was unconscious but otherwise undamaged, while Luna appeared to require no medical attention whatsoever. The match referee, whose primary responsibility had been to determine the exact moment of Luna's inevitable defeat, found himself in the unprecedented position of declaring a human victor over apex-tier opposition. His announcement triggered a chain reaction of disbelief, demands for instant replay analysis, and urgent discussions about whether Academy records needed to include categories for statistical impossibilities. Luna's exit from the arena was as understated as her entrance had been, though the audience's reaction was considerably different. She walked past observers who stared with the sort of intense attention typically reserved for natural phenomena that challenged basic scientific understanding. Her expression remained calm, her pace was unhurried, and her demeanor suggested someone who had just completed a routine academic exercise, rather than rewritten the Academy's assumptions about human combat potential. The aftermath of the match generated the sort of bureaucratic chaos that occurs when institutional certainty encounters inconvenient reality. Faculty members demanded comprehensive analysis of combat footage to determine what had gone wrong with their understanding of human capabilities. Military attachés initiated urgent communications with their home governments to revise threat assessments that no longer appeared adequate. Academy administrators convened emergency sessions to discuss whether existing educational protocols remained applicable to species that could apparently exceed their documented limitations by several orders of magnitude. Thex'ara recovered consciousness several hours later, with no memory of the final moments of the match, and a series of questions about human anatomy that she had never previously considered relevant. Medical analysis revealed that Luna's strike had achieved something that Vortak physiology textbooks claimed was impossible: complete temporary shutdown of their distributed nervous system through precise application of pressure to locations that weren't supposed to be vulnerable points. The technique was so specific that it suggested detailed knowledge of Vortak biology, combined with surgical precision in its application. The betting pools that had established 1,000-to-1 odds against Luna's victory experienced what financial analysts would later describe as total liquidity failure, a polite term for the mathematical impossibility of paying out winnings that exceeded available funds by factors typically associated with national budgets. Several minor gambling syndicates declared bankruptcy, claiming that human victory represented an act of cosmic fraud that voided all previous calculations. Luna's academic standing underwent immediate and dramatic revision. Professors who had spent months documenting her limitations found themselves reassessing combat footage that suddenly looked less like incompetence and more like careful preparation for a very specific objective. Her tactical analysis scores, previously dismissed as irrelevant given her physical limitations, were reconsidered in light of evidence that she had been conducting detailed vulnerability research, while everyone assumed she was struggling with basic course material. The Academy's response to this revelation involved the sort of comprehensive institutional self-examination that occurs when educational certainties prove to be educational assumptions. Course curricula were reviewed to determine whether they adequately addressed the possibility of non-obvious combat effectiveness. Faculty training programs were expanded to include recognition of unconventional tactical approaches. Student evaluation protocols were modified to account for species that might be considerably more dangerous than their test scores suggested. Other students' reactions to Luna's victory followed predictable patterns of denial, rationalization, and eventual nervous accommodation. Those who had dismissed her as harmless began reviewing their previous interactions for signs that they might have misunderstood something important. Species that had assumed human inferiority found themselves wondering what other assumptions might require revision. The Academy's social hierarchy, previously as stable as stellar mechanics, developed the sort of uncertainty that comes from discovering that established facts might be established opinions. Luna herself continued to attend classes, complete assignments, and participate in Academy activities with the same quiet focus that had characterized her entire academic experience. Her only concession to her changed circumstances was a subtle increase in the amount of space that other students maintained around her during combat exercises, a shift in positioning that suggested unconscious recognition that human capabilities might extend beyond documented limitations. The final irony, which the Academy's faculty would spend considerable time discussing in subsequent months, was that Luna's victory had been achieved not through superior strength, speed, or energy manipulation, but through the sort of careful observation and strategic thinking that the Academy had been trying to teach its students from the beginning. While other species had focused on demonstrating their natural advantages, she had been studying their natural disadvantage. While they had prepared to overwhelm opposition through force, she had prepared to neutralize opposition through precision. The galaxy's military hierarchies, built on millennia of assumptions about species superiority and combat effectiveness, would require considerable adjustment to accommodate the possibility that humans represented something more than useful cannon fodder. Intelligence agencies would need to revise their threat assessments, military academies would need to reconsider their training protocols, and warriors throughout known space would need to accept that the quiet student taking notes in the back of the classroom might be considerably more dangerous than their test scores suggested. Luna Kovac had arrived at the Nexus Combat Academy as a representative of humanity's newest addition to galactic military education. She was leaving as evidence that the galaxy's understanding of human potential might need some serious revision. Whether this represented progress or a development that would make future diplomatic relations considerably more complicated remained to be seen. What seemed certain was that the Academy's assumption about the natural order of military capability had just been surgically dismantled by someone who had been paying very careful attention while everyone else was busy being superior.